just to make sure everyone gets a good experience. If you don't know me, I'm Paul. I'm a project manager here with WES, and I'm going to take the first half of the presentation here, and then I'll be passing it off to Keith. So first, I will discuss what is offsite contamination migration. Then I will define what a source parcel is and an affected parcel, and discuss their respective roles in the process. I will then move into how to investigate and remediate contamination on adjacent properties. Then I'll pass it over to Keith, and he's going to explain risk and liabilities regarding offsite migration, potential challenges in cooperation between stakeholders, and then we'll finish with some frequently asked questions and key points to summarize. Contaminant migration is when one or more contaminants from a source property migrate across property boundaries onto another land parcel at concentrations above the applicable land use standards. This can be in any environmental media, including soil, groundwater, vapor, or surface water. So just in the photo we have here, I wanted to kind of walk through it quickly. On the left-hand side here, we have what we are going to be calling the source parcel for this presentation. We have the source here, which is a tank. It's releasing likely hydrocarbons into the groundwater, and they're migrating in the groundwater. That's the pathway over to the affected parcel, and potentially to a receptor. Here we're looking at maybe a groundwater well, or it can maybe be something like a ditch or a offsite lake, anything like that, anything that's sort of receiving body. And that's what we would consider offsite migration. Source parcel. So what are your source parcel responsibilities if you're the owner of that source parcel? The responsible person for the investigated site must provide written notification to the person who owns the neighboring site and a copy of the notification to the Ministry of Environment within 15 days after the responsible person becomes aware of the migration or likely migration of a substance. The notification must include name, address, contact info for the source parcel owner and consultant on the job, as well as a description of the nature of the contamination. You must also have a qualified professional complete a site risk classification. A site can either be classified as high risk or non-high risk. A high risk site is something that has concentrations of parameters exceeding upper cap concentrations. These are basically standards the ministry has set out that are approximately 10 times the regular standards. So if you have really high concentrations of parameters on your site, you may be exceeding upper cap concentrations. That, in conjunction with having a potential active pathway, like I spoke with on the last slide, there's maybe a drinking water well nearby or a close by ditch or lake or something of that sort. That combination will make your site get classified as a high risk site. At this point in time, the Ministry of Environment will get involved, and they require detailed plans on how the situation will be rectified, and you have 90 days to rectify these high-risk conditions. If your site is non-high risk, and this is the majority of the site, actually more than 98% of sites, then there is no time limit or pressure put on the polluter by the Ministry of Environment. This may change, of course, if legal action is taken against the source owner. If you're the affected parcel, the governing principle on contamination liability is the polluter pay principle. That is, an affected parcel is not responsible for contamination sourcing from another owner's property. In the event you are notified of offsite contamination impacting your property, you should obtain all site investigation reports and information from that source parcel owner and their intentions for remediation. It is then recommended that competent advice be sought on how to help interpret the situation and provide advice on how to ensure the best interests or your best interests are upheld. We often recommend getting something in writing from the source parcel, stating their intent and ensuring that they plan on providing you with a copy of all reports upon completion. We often get questions regarding the ministry's role in these situations, and the long and short of it is they do not get involved unless the site is considered high risk, and as we just talked about, that's pretty rare. The ministry encourages both parties to work together and determine a suitable resolution. When it comes to investigating and remediating contaminant migration, In situations where site investigations on your property identify that off-site migration from a neighbor's property has likely occurred, the ministry first expects you to rule out any potential sources of contamination on your property and investigate whether the contamination has migrated through your property and potentially impacted downstream properties. This typically includes the delineation of contamination across your site. In the event that the contamination is determined to migrate through your property and impact a neighboring property, you are still required to submit a notice of offsite migration to that neighbor within 15 days, as previously noted. So you could essentially be a source and an affected parcel. This would make you a flow-through site. Once the contamination has been ruled out as sourcing from your site as the affected parcel, the source parcel should be notified, should be contacted, and all information regarding site investigations, schedules, and remediation plans should be obtained. The ministry then expects information and discussions between the parties to develop a mutually satisfactory remediation plan. This all sounds great, but things don't always go as planned and people don't always cooperate. Keith will expand on the risks and liabilities of these types of properties and some frequently encountered questions and concerns. Keith, can you take it away?
Yeah, thank you for that. So now that we have gone through some of the background and general rules around offsite migration, we're now going to go into a bit of a situational analysis and conduct this by answering some related questions. So the first one is, can an affected or source parcel owner sell their property? What are the risks to the owner and or financer? And also a little bit about Schedule 2 activities. So in terms of the affected parcel, it doesn't really matter that they are not liable for the contamination. They're still considered a contaminated site until it's basically cleaned up. So you'll still be subject to the same limitations as a contaminated site in terms of obtaining financing potentially, getting insurance, or potentially shrinking the buyer pool. And depending on the specific situation, if you did want to sell an affected property or a source parcel, cash sales would likely be the most obvious sale route. The same limitations would also apply for the source parcel. And the best way to limit liability in these situations is to make sure that everything is disclosed upon sale and properly signed off on. Another thing worth noting in terms of the affected parcel is, so you're now considered what's called like a Schedule 2. So those of you who attended our previous webinars on site investigations, you may recognize the term Schedule 2. And typically these activities include auto repairs, gas stations, dry cleaners, like all those properties that the ministry deems as potentially contaminating. So when your property has been impacted from contamination migration, it's also considered a Schedule 2 and you're subject to the same ministry process. This is likely to affect you as the affected parcel because you're under greater regulatory scrutiny if redevelopment is planned. So it doesn't really matter what the activity is on the affected parcel. You could be a residential site or a commercial retail store or what have you. You would still be triggered into that same site investigation process. So next question here is, if you're a source parcel, should you acquire the affected parcel? Is this a smart move? So depending on the specific situation, sometimes it makes sense for the source parcel to purchase the affected parcel. In other words, sometimes it makes sense to buy your problems. By acquiring the affected parcel, you eliminate other parties from being involved. So you control more of the situation, you control the timeline. If you don't need to sell your property right away, you could potentially sit on the contamination for a number of years. And depending if it's hydrocarbon, like gasoline or diesel based, that could help lessen the problem over time. And this could also reduce potential legal fees and disagreements with the affected parcel. This isn't always a good or feasible option, but something to keep in the back of your mind if you're ever encountered with one of these situations. So what are the risks in buying a source or affected parcel? So purchasing a property that has known contamination obviously comes with a number of concerns. Whether that contamination is your fault or the neighbor's fault, it doesn't really matter in the eyes of a lender in most cases. So getting financing will likely be challenging and or may not be possible. There are consulting and legal costs associated with remediating the site that need to be accounted for, no matter if you're acquiring the source or affected parcel. And again, if the goal is redevelopment, this likely will not be possible without a ministry instrument or approval of some kind. Resale could also be challenging due to the concerns mentioned above relating to acquiring a site. So the second, some of you may be asking, like, does my insurance cover this, or is there insurance I can get to protect me against some of these offsite migration concerns? Short answer is yes. Not under your common building insurance or anything, but I am aware of some policies, specifically contractors' pollution policy and an environmental impairment policy that could cover and limit the risk for you for these contamination issues. Some of these policies may require some form of testing or something to secure the insurance, but again, it's best to speak to an adjuster if you're considering that type of risk protection. The next question, what if a responsible person for the source parcel can't be found or can't afford the contaminant or the liability associated? So this is where an environmental lawyer should be sought. The current owner of the site may be held responsible if the previous owner can't be found or is no longer alive. If the polluter cannot afford the contamination, then it depends how patient you want to be for them to deal with it on their own schedule, or could ramp up the aggressiveness in terms of the legal route. Next is related to occupational concerns. So can vapor concentrations be high enough that the building is deemed unsafe for occupational exposure? So when there's contamination that migrates onto a property, if it's gasoline or some other type of contamination, it can give off gases. So these off gases can get into the occupational space. But generally, when this happens to a degree that's concerning, the site is considered high risk. And so, as Paul was mentioning, if the site is considered high risk, the ministry can get involved and sort of encourage the source parcel to fix the high risk conditions, or they may be subject to some fines. So generally, if you're dealing with an offsite migration issue in terms of occupational exposure, it'll usually be captured under the high risk conditions if it's being assessed properly. So obviously, when you're dealing with multiple parties, there could be some potential challenges. One of those might be, so what if the source parcel is not cooperating? If the source parcel is not cooperating in terms of advancing the remediation activities at the affected parcel, a lawyer should be retained to determine the best course of action against that parcel. We can try to negotiate and stuff like that, but sometimes a lawyer is the best route to ensure your interests are upheld. And so another question is, so what if the affected parcel won't let us investigate at their site? What do we do in that instance? So in the event that they won't let you access to the site to complete the investigation or remediation you need to do, the owner of where the property was sourcing from, they'll need to carry out some sort of broad characterization around the perimeter of the property. So basically, if you can't get access there, you just want to make sure that, around the property, it's still defined and is not impacted any further downstream properties. If this can't be completed, if you can't get around the property for some reason, there are some ministry approvals you can get to not further investigate that. So this kind of leads into the next question: should I cooperate as the affected parcel for investigation or remediation activities? This should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, depending on what your intention is for the site. But generally, refusing access could impact your future sale, financing, or redevelopment of that property. Because, as mentioned before, you're still considered a contaminated site. So cooperating between the parties is generally encouraged, because you want to make sure that your site is getting cleaned up. And if you don't allow them access, then basically you're kind of forfeiting that option. But we have seen some cases where buildings are relatively new, they're constructed on zero lot lines. So any sort of investigation or remediation that would occur would result in just a significant amount of disturbance that is just simply not worth it to that owner. So you do reserve that right as well. And then as an affected parcel in these negotiations, do I have a say on how my site is remediated? So we put in brackets there, numerical versus risk assessment remediation. So this is a bit of a tricky one. So the source parcel, so where the contamination is coming from, is only required to remediate any neighboring property to the provincial standards. So this can take the form of the numerical route, where you're removing all the contamination by excavation, for example, which is more of a complete remediation solution. Or you can do the risk assessment route, which is basically safely leaving the material in place. So some affected parcel owners are not really proponents of the risk-based solution because, as mentioned, that contaminated material still remains in ground. So if you require handling of that material in the future, for example, during redevelopment, it would still need to be treated as contaminated material, which would potentially increase the cost for that person. So you can see how maybe these negotiations can get contentious at times. That said, in our experience, to avoid obstructionist or contentious behavior, which can generally drive up cost due to the amount of consulting and legal fees, it is best to start negotiating in good faith to ensure that both parties are satisfied with the outcome. So some other related topics here. I just wanted to discuss a little bit about land use differences between source and affected parcels. So, because this can be a little bit counterintuitive for some people. So for example, if you had an industrial property where the contaminant levels are acceptable for that use, for the industrial land use, but they migrate offsite to a lower classification land use. For example, that can be a residential or commercial property. It could, and it exceeds that residential or commercial standard, it would, although it's not considered contamination on your site, it would be considered contamination on their site. So we worked on a site where contamination existed at the rear of the property. It was a commercial activity, used to be a former dry cleaner, and bordering behind it was a residential property. So it was contaminated on the source parcel, but as soon as it migrated across this imaginary like property line, it ended up being a high-risk site. So keeping these land use sort of things in mind, I find is helpful. The opposite is also true though. So if you have a commercial property and there's contamination that migrates into the roadway, roadways are considered industrial use, which is sort of the land use classification higher. So what's contaminated on your site may not be considered contamination on the roadway site. So you wouldn't require to do anything else in that case. So the next one is, why do I need to investigate someone else's problem if I'm basically innocent in this situation? So this is kind of a weird one. Like I don't really agree with it, but this is basically the ministry's way to ensure that there is not confusion as to who is liable for the contamination, and also that any properties that are potentially impacted downstream also get notified through this process. That said, there's nothing stopping you from approaching the source parcel early in the process to try to get an earlier resolution to things. Although if you have proven through investigations that you are an affected parcel, or the contamination sourced on a parcel flowed through your site and impacted another downstream site, once you do that investigation, you can then seek legal damages from the source parcel to recoup both the investigation and remediation costs. So again, this leads into what happens if I am just a flow-through site, so where contamination is sourcing uphill, migrates through my site, and impacted a downhill property. So you need to show that contamination is coming onto and leaving your property, but the benefit is this means that you are not a responsible party, and so you wouldn't be responsible for delineating and defining any other contamination like downstream. So once you have investigated and delineated the contamination across your property, you then would pursue the legal route to try to get refunded for those environmental costs. So that's basically sums up our sort of scenario analysis on offsite migration issues. We'll just summarize some key points here for you guys. So when you're a source parcel and you notice that there's offsite migration occurring or is likely occurring, impacting your neighbor, you have 15 days to notify them through the official ministry channels that Paul discussed. And then so it's important to obtain all site investigation reports and information on their intentions and schedule for remediating your site. You don't want this to get lost in the wash and then nothing happens for a period of time. It's also important to seek competent advice because there's a lot of variability in these situations, and the right route is going to depend on the specifics of that situation. So seeking competent advice from consultants and lawyers is important. The ministry expects the affected parcel to investigate contamination across their property. And then again, you would sue the source parcel responsible for any sort of damages that come from that. The affected parcel is considered a contaminated site and subject to the same financing sale limitations until that remediation is completed. And then it's important to share information and hold discussions to determine appropriate schedules and remediation of both the affected and source parcels. And finally, if you are an affected parcel, make sure you obtain all final investigation remediation reports because you'll need these to obviously sell or finance the property in the future. So with that, it summarizes our presentation, and we'll just open it up to the Q&A here.
Thanks, guys. So if anybody does have any questions or comments, please feel free to unmute yourself, or if you prefer to chat in the chat box, please put a question in there. We are about 30 minutes into the presentation, so we'll allow for about 15 minutes of question and answer.
Well, maybe I could start off, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
And of course, all of this presentation gratefully received, by the way, but it certainly stirs up all sorts of scenarios in one's mind. And especially when you've been around as long as I have, I've run across situations over the years, and certainly in the last 10 or 15 years, the implications of the environmental have certainly just gotten a lot more stringent than what we used to deal with in the past. In one case, we had a source. The buyer bought the property without any knowledge of the environmental implications at all, and got financed through the mortgage company and everything with no issues. This is going back some years. The polluter, as it turned out, had long since passed off the scene, both corporately and personally. And then that individual had nowhere to turn for assistance in dealing with the costs, which were significant because, of course, it did migrate to properties next door and undermine the building and all sorts of things. And so the polluter pays. That's all nice to say, but if the polluter can't be found and there's no approach that you can take, is there no remedy through government's funding to help in this regard for this poor property owner who's stuck with a polluted property that he knew nothing about?
Totally. Yeah, it's a really good question, Bev. Yeah, the polluter pays principle is more like a guiding principle. Obviously, you just highlighted a scenario where it doesn't always apply. And then the liability obviously falls onto the next responsible person in that. So in that case, it was the owner. There are a couple, I know there's a clause in the CSR that if you innocently acquire a property by performing like all your appropriate due diligence stuff, you can maybe be excluded from being held liable. That's more of a legal question on that, but I have seen that route pursued in past.
Right.
And more recently, like there have been some government funds for what are called like quote unquote brownfields, where the responsible person can't be found, or, you know, it's kind of just this derelict property. They used to have a fund for that. I think the last time it was funded was in 2008. So as of now, there's no ministry, I guess, funding available for those type of situations. I think it's a big misstep because it would obviously generate a lot of economic, environmental, and social benefits for the community at large. But as of now, it's not something that's offered. Maybe in the future, who knows?
There goes our taxes up again.
Yeah.
It really just highlights the importance of doing your proper due diligence, though, as well. Like, I know things have changed from when you properly acquired it 15 or 20 years ago, and what's required now is much greater than what was required then. But it just makes you think and reminds you that proper due diligence is important.
So just a supplemental, if I may, with regards to the affected property, you did mention hydrocarbons and whether or not it deems the affected property uninhabitable because of the off-gassing and so on. There's other contaminants too that might render a property not habitable. So who determines that degradation that affected property is forced to mitigate the situation? And it could be that there's a significant building situate on the site, and just physically, how on earth do you undermine the whole building to get at the contaminated materials?
Yeah.
That's a good one.
It's a good one for sure. I mean, there definitely are ways of approaching that. So first, like doing a proper assessment and making sure that those readings that you're getting are representative of what workers or people are being exposed to is obviously the first thing you would look at. Going a step further, like it may sound complicated, but like we kind of treat it like similar to radon, where you just need some sort of like sub-slab decompression system to help move air around so that you're not being exposed to the same amount. And I mean, depending on the scale of the building and stuff, I mean, obviously there's potential engineering and stuff involved, but
yes.
Definitely doable without, you know, demoing the building or something crazy like that.
Okay, I'll take your word for it.
Hopefully.
Thanks, Bev. Did anybody else have any other questions they would like to ask at this time?
Any questions?
We did have one question received earlier today. If a risk assessment is completed as a form of remediation and upon selling my property, the value of my property becomes affected due to the stigma of this form of remediation, do I then sue the source site for damages?
Mm-hmm.
Keith or Paul, did you want to respond?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that one's super tricky because technically the source parcel only has to remediate to provincial standards, and risk assessment is an acceptable form of remediation. So they have completed their provincial mandated obligation. But you're right, a risk assessed property may sell for less on the market. So they may be able to acquire a legal opinion and sue for those losses or damages upon the sale. If they can get a appraiser to show that if there was no contamination, it would be worth this, and this is what it's going for on the market, they could potentially have a case for the difference, I think. I mean, again, that's a legal question, but I think there is a case there.
Thanks, Paul. And then one final question here. Are there any exceptions to leave contaminated soil from a leaky underground tank in an affected parcel after it's proved to have come from a neighboring source site?
You want to take that one, Paul?
Yeah, just wrapping my head around that. Are there any exceptions? The only way that you can leave the contamination, I guess, in place would be, like Keith mentioned, in a risk assessment. If there's no drinking water wells or any other routes of access to human or ecological sources on the site, then you might be able to show that it's okay to be left in place. It's probably the cheaper option if the source parcel isn't willing to cooperate and do the full remediation on your affected parcel. It'd probably be the cheaper option to risk assess and then seek legal option for the damages is what I would say. I think that's what the question was asking.
I mean, you may be able to get some sort of authorization from the affected property owner to just say, like, yeah, I mean, it's good to stay there, but it's going to be hard to obtain, but
it would be very generous.
Very generous.
Both for a buyer. Puts them in a catbird seat in some respect.
Okay, well, thanks again, Keith and Paul. Did anybody else have any parting comments or questions?
No, thank you very much for the presentation. We'll be in
Okay.
touch.
Thank you. And if
Thanks,
anybody
Beth.
would like, I was going to just close. If anybody would like a recording of the presentation, just email me and I would be happy to send that to you. Otherwise, thank you all for taking time out of your busy lives to join us today. And thank you so much. We'll see you at the next webinar.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.